Autonomic nervous system is a division of a nervous system as a somatic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system, in contrast with the somatic nervous system, controls the internal organs, glands, and fulfills the unconscious control. That's why it is autonomic in the sense of autonomic from the conscious effort. Autonomic nervous system is divided into several divisions: sympathetic, parasympathetic, and also the third division that we call metasympathetic division. Enteric nervous system that is located in the plexuses of the intestine are an example of metasympathetic nervous system that is produced by the local reflex arches found in the organs with motor activity, for example in the stomach or intestine. Now we will discuss predominantly the peculiarities of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and after we will say a few words about the metasympathetic nervous system. First, the reflex arch of the autonomic nervous system. It looks different in comparison with the reflex arch of the somatic nervous system. Spinal cord, gray matter, and the most important thing is that the bodies of the efferent neurons are located in the lateral horns of the gray matter, and they propagate to the ganglion, autonomic ganglion. Autonomic ganglion also is including the bodies of the second efferent neuron of the autonomic nervous system. And an axon of a second neuron propagates to the innervated organ, for example, to the heart in this example. So, if in the somatic nervous system we see one efferent neuron, then in the autonomic nervous system we may see two efferent neurons. One, or the first one, is called preganglionic, and it produces nerve fibers type B, thin myelinated fibers, and the second efferent neuron in the autonomic nervous system is called postganglionic neuron, and it produces nerve fibers type C, unmyelinated nerve fibers. And now we will focus on the differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We will draw the central nervous system, brain and the spinal cord, and on the left side we will draw sympathetic, and on the right parasympathetic nervous system. So they are responsible for different conditions of the body. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for fight or flight response. In other words, for stress. Parasympathetic nervous system is called anabolic nervous system. So, anabolism is a synthesis of complex chemical compounds in the body from simple ones. It is the recovery of the damaged cells. So after stress, sometimes we have to intensify the regeneration of the damaged cells, the composition of fat depot, carbohydrates depot. So it's the recovery after the stress. And sympathetic nervous system, it increases catabolism, because catabolism is the breakdown of substances with the release of energy, and energy is crucial for performance to confront the stressful situation. Okay, the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system are located in the thoracolumbar part of the spinal cord. From T1 to L2, lumbar segment number 2, and up to the thoracic segment number 1. So here we have the neurons, preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. From the body of this neuron, the nerve fibers of the sympathetic nervous system are leaving the spinal cord and go to the ganglions, sympathetic ganglions, that are located in the vicinity of the spinal cord, close to the spinal cord. That's why the localization of these ganglions may be characterized as a paravertebral or prevertebral ganglions, close to the spinal cord. They may constitute so-called sympathetic trunk, the chain of ganglions parallel to the spinal cord. And postganglionic fibers in the sympathetic nervous system are long, as we can see, and they reach the innervated organ. Again, we may illustrate it, and show the heart. What is important that is in the ganglions of the sympathetic nervous system, from one preganglionic nerve fiber, we quite often may see the divergence of excitation and multiplication of excitations to many postganglionic fibers. In fact, this is an emergency division of autonomic nervous system. That's why it should simultaneously activate many organs to confront the stress. That's why we can see divergence in the ganglions of the sympathetic nervous system. The next question is about the transmitters and receptors in the sympathetic nervous system. In ganglions, acetylcholine is released, and here we may find nicotinic cholinereceptors. Nicotinic receptors. On the organ in the sympathetic nervous system, norepinephrine is released, and we may find alpha and beta adrenoreceptors. So it is important to remember that the effects of the sympathetic nervous system are noradrenergic. In different organs, we may find different types of alpha and beta adrenoreceptors. Alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3 receptors. And by the stimulation of these receptors, the sympathetic nervous system produces different effects. For example, it's quite logical. The cardiac activity by the sympathetic nervous system increases. The bronchus dilate because the organism has to respire frequently for exchange of oxygen. So bronchs dilate. The pupil of an eye dilates also to see better, the activity of the stomach of intestine decreases. Gastrointestinal tract activity decreases because during the stress it's not the best time to digest. Blood vessels of the skin contract. The vascular tone of the blood vessels in the skin increases, the skin gets pale. But in some organs the blood vessels may also dilate. Also it depends on the receptors, the types of receptors that may be found in that organ. Parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system that is called rest or digest. Its preganglionic neurons are located in the sacral part of the spinal cord, S2 to S4, but also in the brainstem, in medulla oblongata, in midbrain, where we may find the nuclei of the cranial nerves. So some cranial nerves, and namely third pair, oculomotorius, seventh facial nerve, 9 glossopharyngeal nerve, and 10th vagus nerve are belonging to the parasympathetic nervous system. Especially vagus nerve is very important. So from this nuclei the preganglionic nerve fibers begin, and they are quite long. They go directly to the ganglion, and the ganglions are located close in vicinity to the organ. So for example, this is the stomach, and ganglion is located maybe inside the organ. Therefore we may call such ganglions intraorganic or intramural. Mur is a wall of an organ. So the ganglions are paraorganic, close to an organ, and postganglionic nerve fiber are short. Transmitters and receptors in the ganglions: acetylcholine and nicotinic receptors, similar to the sympathetic nervous system. Here we can see no difference. But on the organ, by postganglionic nerve fiber, in parasympathetic nervous system, also acetylcholine is released, and we may find cholinereceptors, muscarinic receptors, and that is quite different from the sympathetic nervous system. So in that respect we may call parasympathetic effects cholinergic in comparison with noradrenergic effects of the sympathetic nervous system. Effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. Cardiac activity decreases, the bronchs constrict, pupil constriction of a pupil, gastrointestinal tract is stimulated, and secretion and motor activity is increased, anabolic processes are stimulated. Some functions are intensified by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. For example, the salivation, the production of saliva is intensified by sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, but the composition of saliva is quite different. The parasympathetic nervous system stimulates the production of liquid saliva that is rich with enzyme. Sympathetic nervous system stimulates the production of viscous saliva that is poor, that has a low concentration of the enzymes, but that has the high concentration of mucose. The blood vessels are almost not innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Only in pelvic region, in the salivary glands, and some other parts of the body, the blood vessels get the parasympathetic innervation. But predominantly sympathetic nervous control is done here. Adrenal medulla is innervated only by the sympathetic nerve fibers, and here in adrenal medulla we may find only preganglionic nerve fibers. This is an exclusion, so we will draw the adrenal medulla, and postganglionic fibers are absent in that case, and adrenal medulla, as we know, produces adrenaline and norepinephrine, epinephrine and norepinephrine, without postganglionic nerve fibers. Kerdo index may estimate the autonomic tone of an individual. The autonomic tone reflects the predominance of sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system in the body. So because some people may have the prevalence of parasympathetic nervous system, it is called vagotony, or the prevalence of the sympathetic nervous system, sympathicotony. To calculate this index, we should use a simple formula. Here we should use diastolic blood pressure, DBP, and we should measure the heart rate. So if we will divide DBP by heart rate, and then we will subtract and multiply by 100%, we will get the index. If it will be less than minus 10%, it will indicate that there is vagotony, the prevalence of parasympathetic nervous system. If the index will be more than 10%, plus 10%, sympathicotony. If it will be between minus 10 and plus 10, normatonic type of regulation. Also, we can define the autonomic reactivity. It means the type of autonomic response in the situation of stress. For example, cold pressure stress may be used, application of cold objects to the skin, or orthostatic reactivity when person is changing the position from lying to supine to vertical position, and autonomic nervous system should change the vascular tone in order to provide the optimal blood pressure in the blood vessels of the brain to compensate the decrease of blood pressure after the standing up. Adaptive effect of the autonomic nervous system. It was proved in the experiment of Orbelli, and what was done? The muscle, skeletal muscle, was stimulated by the somatic nervous system, and the contraction of this muscle was registered. So we have a myogram, and at the end the muscle was tired, fatigue, and the amplitude of contractions decreased. While the scientist continued the stimulation of the somatic nerve, additionally the excitation of the sympathetic nerve was done, and when sympathetic nervous system was stimulated in this situation, the muscle that was tired began to contract with increased force and amplitude. So it was proved that the sympathetic nervous system increases the potential ability of a muscle to work harder in order to get an increased adaptive response to the stressful situation. And now we will discuss the metasympathetic nervous system that was found, as we already mentioned, in the stomach, in the intestine, where it produces enteric brain, as it is may be expressed in English, where the number of neurons is making a huge number, and this system is produced by the local reflexes, where the afferent neuron, interconnecting or relay neuron, and the efferent neurons are located in the borders of this organ and not involving the spinal cord and other central nervous system in the functioning of this reflex arch. So it is the local regulation of an organ. This local regulation adjusts the activity of the organ to the local needs. So it's like a local government. And the metasympathetic nervous system also gets an inputs from the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. There is a tight interaction between them. In this nervous system, the neurotransmitters that are released may be quite unique. For example, here we have neuropeptide Y. We have certain other peptides involved in the regulation. Sometimes we have the ATP that may serve as a transmitter and other peculiar properties. Autonomic reflexes may be classified into several groups. For example, viscerosensory reflexes from internal organs to the different receptors, for example, of the skin. An example, when there is pathological process in the heart, then the pain is normally is induced not at the area of the heart, but at the shoulder blade or maybe the mandibula. So this is an example of viscerosensory reflex. Sensory visceral reflexes. For example, in the Chinese medicine, the stimulation of different parts of the skin may influence the distant internal organs. So this is an example of sensory visceral reflexes. And visceral reflexes, for example, the Gehring reflex, the reflex that changes the cardiac activity in response to the respiration, the inhalation and exhalation changes. They change the heart rate. It is an example of visceral reflex.